Welcome, everybody. How are you? Well, today's topic is kind of a hard topic. And it's about the biggest tree in the world. You know what that is? The tree of sin. The tree of sin. We're going to talk about sin tonight. And I know that's a topic we don't like to discuss, but we need to understand about sin. You know, actually, we call the New Testament the gospel. You know what gospel means? It means the good news. Well, also, there's a lot of bad news in the gospel, too. There's a lot of bad news. And some of the bad news, the good news is there's a solution. But some of the bad news in the good news is, well, Psalms tells us, and also Paul repeats in Romans, the third chapter, 10th verse, as it is written in Psalms, there is no one righteous, not even one. Paul says that we have all sinned. We have all sinned, and we've all fallen short of the glory of God. Well, that's the bad news. That we're all sinners, and that we all fall short of the glory of God. None are righteous, not even one. Now, if that was the conclusion of this program, then this program would be a very depressing program, wouldn't it be? Well, we have to understand our sin before we can deal with it. And that's the good news, that we can deal with our sin. So we want to talk about sin tonight. And the best place to start is the origin of sin, the original sin. This concept that we're all born with original sin. I had the hardest time to understand that, didn't you? You look at a newborn baby, you look at that baby and you wonder, how in the world could this baby have sin? What in the world did this baby do? Can you imagine? You look at a newborn baby, but as soon as that baby is born, it's born in sin. How can we understand this concept of original sin? What in the world could a baby do in the womb that would be sinful? What was he doing in there? Smoking and drinking? In the womb? How could he do that? What did he do? And, well, this is a misconception. The baby didn't commit original sin. None of us committed the original sin. We have inherited the original sin. Where did the original sin come from? I hope you've been with us several weeks because we studied the original sin. What was the original sin? We learned that the original sin came from mankind's first ancestors, the root of our lineage. And the Bible calls these individuals Adam and Eve. So the original sin comes from the origin of man's lineage. And these two individuals, Adam and Eve. God gave them, well, first he gave them an ideal. He said, become fruitful. This means become a tree of life, which means become perfect. Become one with me. Establish the true relationship between God and man. And then next, multiply. Multiply. And multiply this goodness. So Adam and Eve should have been perfect and then multiplied this perfection that ultimately then would expand to a wonderful world or an ideal world or the kingdom of heaven on earth. And he gave them a responsibility to accomplish this. And he gave them a commandment. He said, don't eat of the fruit. Now, we studied what the fruit is. Basically, the fruit is that they shouldn't have eaten was the misuse of love. Don't misuse love. In other words, before you love each other, before you multiply, you have to be fruitful. So we could say there's a prerequisite, even in the Garden of Eden, before marriage. There's a prerequisite that had to be fulfilled before Adam and Eve could have a God-centered, qualified, God-approved, God-sanctioned marriage. And what was that? To complete their growth, to become fruitful. So fruitfulness, or individual perfection, is the prerequisite to marriage, even in the Garden of Eden. And this is so that when husband and wife would come together in holy matrimony, then their lineage would be the lineage of who? God, would be God's lineage. And so if God's lineage could multiply, then we would see ultimately the expansion of the kingdom of heaven. But unfortunately, Adam and Eve didn't complete their growth. They went the way of multiplication before they went the way of fruitfulness. How do we know? Well, you can either study the divine principle, or you can open the window and look at the world. It's obvious that Adam and Eve multiplied, isn't it? The evidence is there, isn't it? That Adam and Eve made a lineage that multiplied. But what isn't there is a multiplication of goodness or fruitfulness. We don't see the kingdom of heaven. So we can assume that Adam and Eve multiplied without God's permission. They sinned. They sinned. So this has created then a barrier. Let's try to understand this barrier. This means that Adam and Eve essentially became parents, began a lineage in sin. In other words, without God's qualification. They had not fulfilled the prerequisite. So they were not qualified to be parents, were they? So therefore, what about their children? Could their children really be qualified to be children? If the parents are not qualified, then the children can't be qualified to really be God's children. So Adam and Eve had children who weren't qualified really to be God's children. Therefore, no one could become a true parent. The children of Adam and Eve could not go beyond this barrier. This barrier. This barrier is the point from which they fell. They were growing towards this ideal, and we say that they were about 2/3 of the way there when they fell. So they departed from God's way about 2/3 of the way. Almost there, but not quite. So from the point from which they fell to the point where they fell, then has become a prison. Has become a prison. So therefore, they were not qualified to be parents. They were not qualified to start a lineage. Therefore, the children of Adam and Eve, they couldn't go beyond this point, no matter what they did, no matter how good they were, no matter how much they prayed, no matter how much they fasted. No one could escape this area. All those born of this lineage could not be qualified. The children of Adam and Eve were not qualified to be born even. And they grow up. Can it be possible for them to be true qualified parents? It's impossible. Therefore, they did grow up and they multiplied, but what about their children? They couldn't be qualified either. And unqualified children cannot be qualified to be parents. And on and on and on and on. This cycle from parents to child, parents to child, parents to child. And going through history and then ultimately to our own birth. Then what about us? Is it any different? So original sin means we're born without qualification. We're born without qualification. That's why Paul said none is righteous, not even one. We're all sinners. We all fall short of the glory of God. And the problem is our ancestors. We've all got bad ancestors. We're struggling with our ancestors. And that is why, as we talked about last week, ultimately salvation means rebirth, coming out of this lineage and grafting on to a new lineage. We need a new ancestor. A new ancestor. That's why man needs a Messiah. Ultimately, to solve this problem of the passing on of original sin from parents to child, man needs a different ancestor. And so that's the Messiah. That's why Bible says that Jesus came as the next Adam. That's why he said, before Abraham was, I am, because he took the role of not a fallen ancestor like Adam was, but a good ancestor, a true ancestor. So ultimately, overcoming this original sin, man needs the Messiah to relate to the Messiah. So again, original sin comes to us not because we did it, but we inherited it through our lineage, So no matter what you do, you can't get rid of it. You can pray from now until your death, and it's still in there. You can fast. I could fast until I turned into a chopstick. Maybe my wife would like that. I could stand to lose a little weight, right? But I could fast until I began to look like, like a chopstick. Still, that original sin is there. You can do many mighty works, can't get rid of it. There's only one way to get rid of it. Got to change your lineage. Change your lineage. And so to do that, we need the Messiah as our true ancestor. Well, there's another kind of sin, and this is hereditary sin. So we look at original sin like the root. It's the root of sin. And hereditary sin is like the trunk. What is hereditary sin? This is the sin of our ancestors, our immediate ancestors. Adam and Eve are our first ancestor, our common ancestor, but we also have immediate ancestors. Your great-great-uncles and great-great-grandparents, your immediate ancestral lineage. We are affected by what our ancestors did. And there's a lot of evidence to support this. For instance, if you examine the ancestors of people who are criminals, you'll find 9 times out of 10 their ancestors were criminals. Or if you look, if somebody who is abusing their children, if you examine their ancestry, usually they were people who were abused themselves. So there is an inheritance of sin through our immediate ancestry. And there's a shared responsibility. If your ancestors committed sins, then the descendants have to share that responsibility. There's so much evidence to support that. Haven't you noticed that sometimes you'll read about a family that has so much suffering come to them? So many tragedies, so many accidents. So many of the family members die in a tragic or die young. This is an indication of ancestral sin that is inherited through the lineage. This is another kind of sin that we have to deal with and take responsibility for. In a lesser degree, it's similar to original sin. Original sin, the root. Hereditary sin is the trunk. How about collective sin? Collective sin is like the branches. And this is the sin of a group, or a group of people, or a certain nation. For instance, there's such a thing as a national sin. And maybe, and if you're a part of that nation, maybe you didn't participate in that national sin, but you suffer because of it. And I think a very clear example is the United States. In the beginning, God created this nation to really be a Christian nation, a God-centered nation. But when they made the Constitution, they made it a little bit hazy in terms of allowing slavery. So they allowed slavery in the beginning, in the history of America. And because of this national sin, For America to allow slavery was a national sin. Then the nation had to take responsibility for this collective sin or national sin. And the way that sin was dealt with was the Civil War. The nation was divided, and the nation, everyone, suffered for a 4-year period because collectively we had to take responsibility for this collective sin. There are many examples in history. For instance, because mankind didn't receive Jesus 2,000 years ago, then what is the history of Christianity? For instance, Christianity in Rome. What happened to Christians in Rome? They really suffered. They were fed to the lions. They had to go through incredible persecution and suffering because they had to take responsibility representing mankind for the collective sin of not receiving the Messiah when he came 2,000 years ago. So there are many examples of a collective sin. Also, this is one we're very familiar with, unfortunately, and that's personal sin. Then we as individuals, we commit sin. What would a good definition of sin be? Personal sin. Sin is any thought or action that violates God's principle, that makes a base for Satan to relate to me. In other words, when you commit a personal sin, when you sin, you become more like the master of sin. That's why he tempts us to do sin, because he wants us to be like him. And the more we become like him, the more he can relate to us. But we don't want that kind of relationship, do we? What's another way that we could define sin? Simple, a general way to decide if you're sinning or not is sacrificing others for the sake of myself. When you're doing that, you can guarantee that you're sinning. You're sinning. Sacrificing others for the sake of myself. When I do things out of self-interest, when I do things out of self-glorification, don't we sometimes like to do things to glorify ourselves? It's sin. When we do things out of the desire for self-gratification, when we do things out of a desire to self-justify ourselves, usually we can be sure, be guaranteed that these things are sin. So, I'm not going to stand up here and say, what are sins? Well, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do this, don't do that. These are the sins that you can and cannot do. It's not that simple. So much of sin involves your motivation. What's your motivation? For instance, I've met a lot of alcoholics, a lot of drunks that told me, Jesus drank. Right? Haven't you seen that? He drank wine, so it's okay, I can drink. Right? But don't you think there's a difference in motivation between the drunk and Jesus drinking wine in the Last Supper? Don't you think there's a difference in motivation? This is the subtle area of sin, personal sin, to really dig out our own motivation. What is it? Sacrificing others for the sake of myself. This is really the fertile ground for sin. So we want to change our direction. And if we can think of others, if we can change the direction of sin, in other words, if we can instead sacrifice ourselves for the sake of others, then we can be assured that we're making a fertile ground to really come closer to God. So these 4 major areas of sin we need to know. But ultimately, as we mentioned, the solution to sin, the final solution is got to change our lineage. Got to come out of the bad lineage and come into the good lineage. And in order to do that, we have to meet a new ancestor. That's the Messiah. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Here are the highlights from Reverend McCarthy's lecture on types of sin. First, original sin. Second, hereditary sin. Third, collective sin. And fourth, personal sin.